Margaret Walsh had buried her son 3 days ago. The $12 million estate overlooking the Pacific sat empty, its deed hidden in her bedroom drawer. She'd made sure his wife Sarah knew nothing about the inheritance. But on this rain-soaked Tuesday morning, as Margaret sat alone with her grief, she heard a car pull into her driveway. Through the window, she watched Sarah step out, not with tears or anger, but with something unexpected in her hands. What happened next would shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about the daughter-in-law she'd kept in the dark. Margaret Walsh had built her fortune quietly, the way successful people often do. From a small accounting firm in Portland, she'd grown a real estate empire worth tens of millions. But money she'd learned couldn't buy the one thing she treasured most, her relationship with her son David. David had married Sarah 5 years earlier, against Margaret's wishes. Not because Sarah was unkind, but because Margaret saw something she recognized too well, the hunger for security that comes from growing up with nothing. Sarah had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes, never knowing where her next meal would come from. Margaret understood that desperation intimately. She'd lived it herself decades earlier. When David died suddenly of a heart attack at 32, Margaret made a decision that would haunt her. She told Sarah about the life insurance policy, the modest savings account, even the small rental property David owned. But she said nothing about the crown jewel, the $12 million oceanfront estate in Malibu that David was set to inherit. Her reasoning felt sound in those first dark days of grief. Sarah was young. She'd remarry, move on, build a new life. But this house, this legacy, it belonged to the Walsh family bloodline. Margaret convinced herself she was protecting David's memory, preserving something sacred. But few knew the real reason Margaret kept the secret. Years earlier, she'd overheard Sarah on the phone, talking about what she'd do when the old lady finally goes. The words had cut deep, confirming Margaret's worst fears about her daughter-in-law's intentions. Now, 3 days after David's funeral, Margaret sat in her modest Portland home, the hidden deed feeling heavier with each passing hour. She'd planned to reveal the truth eventually, maybe in a year or two, once she was certain Sarah's grief was genuine. But Sarah had other plans. The knock on Margaret's door came at 9:17 a.m. Through the peephole, she saw Sarah standing on the porch, holding what looked like a manila envelope and a small potted plant. Margaret's first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home. The weight of her secret felt unbearable in Sarah's presence. But something in Sarah's posture, the way her shoulders curved inward, the careful way she held herself, made Margaret open the door. "Sarah, dear, I wasn't expecting you." "I know, Margaret. I hope you don't mind. I brought you something." Sarah's voice was softer than usual, almost fragile. Margaret led her to the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd hidden the Malibu house deed just days earlier. Sarah placed the potted plant on the table, a small succulent with a handwritten note tied to it. "David always said you had the most beautiful garden," Sarah began, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. "He told me you taught him that plants need both sunshine and storms to grow strong. I thought maybe you'd like this one." Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She'd expected anger, demands, questions about David's estate. Instead, Sarah seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. "There's something else," Sarah continued, sliding the manila envelope across the table. "I found this among David's papers. I think he meant for you to have it." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of photos, pictures of her and David throughout his life, many she'd never seen before. David at 5, helping her plant roses. David at graduation, his arm around her shoulders. David at his wedding, whispering something in Margaret's ear that made her laugh. But it was the letter at the bottom of the envelope that stopped Margaret's breath entirely. The letter was in David's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. It was addressed to Sarah, but the contents made Margaret's chest tighten with shame. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and I need you to know some things about my mother. She's going to push you away. She's going to test you. She did the same thing to me for years before she realized I wasn't going anywhere. Margaret Walsh has been hurt by people who wanted her money more than they wanted her. She's built walls so high that sometimes even I couldn't scale them. But underneath all that protection is the most generous, loving heart I've ever known. Please don't give up on her. She needs family more than she'll ever admit, and you're the daughter she never had but always wanted." Margaret looked up to find Sarah watching her carefully. "He wrote this about you," Sarah said quietly. "But Margaret, I think he also wrote it about me. I know you don't trust me. I know you think I married David for security, for a better life. And maybe part of that was true in the beginning. I won't lie to you about that." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. But what David gave me wasn't money or status. It was belonging. For the first time in my life, I had a family. And when he died, I didn't just lose a husband. I lost the only family I'd ever known, including you. Margaret felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally break free. The secret of the Malibu house felt like a stone in her chest, growing heavier with each of Sarah's words. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been hiding." She walked to her bedroom, Sarah following silently. From the drawer beside her bed, Margaret pulled out the deed to the Malibu estate. Her hands shook as she placed it on the bed between them. This was David's inheritance, a $12 million property overlooking the ocean. He was supposed to get it on his 35th birthday. Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I kept it from you because I was afraid. Afraid you'd take it and disappear. Afraid you'd sell it and forget David ever existed." Sarah stared at the deed, her face unreadable. The silence stretched between them until Margaret was certain she'd destroyed whatever fragile connection they'd begun to rebuild. But then Sarah did something that shattered every assumption Margaret had built about her daughter-in-law. She folded the deed carefully and handed it back to Margaret. "Keep it," Sarah said simply. "I don't understand. Margaret, I don't want your house. I never did. What I wanted was for you to want me to have it. I wanted you to trust me enough to tell me about it. I wanted to be family, not just legally, but really. The money, the house, none of that matters if it comes with conditions and tests and walls between us." Sarah sat on the edge of Margaret's bed, the same bed where Margaret had hidden her secret for 3 days. "When I was 16, I lived with a foster family who kept testing me. They'd leave money on the counter, watches on the dresser, anything to see if I'd steal. I never did, but I also never felt like I belonged there because I knew they were always watching, always waiting for me to prove their worst assumptions right." Margaret's throat tightened as she recognized the parallel. I don't want to live that way again, Margaret. I don't want David's inheritance if it means spending the rest of my life proving I deserve it. I'd rather have nothing and know that whatever we build between us is real." In that moment, Margaret saw clearly the test she'd been administering without realizing it. She'd been so afraid of being used that she'd missed the very thing she'd been searching for her entire life, someone who valued relationship over reward. The daughter-in-law she'd kept at arm's length had just chosen love over luxury, family over fortune. 6 months later, Margaret and Sarah stood together on the deck of the Malibu house, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. They decided to keep the property together, not as an inheritance or a transaction, but as a place where David's memory could live on. The house had become something neither Margaret nor Sarah had expected, a bridge between their past hurts and their shared future. Margaret had installed a garden where Sarah grew the vegetables she'd learned to cultivate in foster care. Sarah had created a reading nook where Margaret could work on the memoir she'd always wanted to write. "He would have loved this," Sarah said, gesturing toward the garden where tomatoes and roses grew side by side. "He would have loved that we figured it out," Margaret replied, her voice steady for the first time in months. The two women had learned something profound in those difficult months after David's death. Trust isn't built through tests and trials. It's built through choosing to be vulnerable with each other, again and again, until the walls between hearts finally crumble. Margaret had spent decades protecting herself from people who might want her money, but in her fear of being used, she'd almost missed the person who wanted something far more valuable, to be truly known and accepted. Sarah had spent years proving she belonged somewhere, but in her desperation for security, she'd almost missed the gift of being loved without conditions. They'd both learned that family isn't about blood or law or inheritance. It's about showing up for each other when the world feels impossible, about choosing grace over suspicion, about building something together that neither could create alone. As the stars began to appear over the Pacific, Margaret reached for Sarah's hand. Two women who'd lost the man they both loved had found something unexpected in their grief: each other. The $12 million house had become priceless, not because of its market value, but because it held the space where two wounded hearts had learned to trust again. Sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't money or property. Sometimes it's the radical act of choosing love over fear, of believing in each other's goodness even when we're afraid of being disappointed. What if the person you're testing has already chosen you and you just haven't noticed yet?